Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dealing with Art, Bloomsbury Art Market's live webinar and expert panel presented by Bloomsbury Digital Resources. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jack Soloway, Senior Marketing Executive at Bloomsbury, and I'm delighted to be hosting this incredible program of speakers today in celebration of what is, I'm proud to say, the first comprehensive resource of its kind online, a scholarly hub for art trade research, Bloomsbury Art Markets, protagonists, networks, provenances. Before we begin, I have a few brief housekeeping notes. Today's hour-long program consists of 3 10-minute talks by our expert panelists, preceded by a short introduction to Bloomsbury Art Markets from Rosie Trethewey, our editorial lead on the collection at Bloomsbury Digital Resources, who I will hand over to shortly. We hope this event will serve as a brief yet panoramic excursion to what Johannes Nathan, the resources editor-in-chief, calls the exotic planet of the art world. In its multitude of uncharted territories, as well as the specialists that inhabit them. We also hope to show you how Bloomsbury Art Markets, as a groundbreaking reference work, might support you in your investigations of an ecosystem as varied and as intricate as this one. If you'd like to ask a question during the event, we ask that you please do so using the question and answer tab at the bottom of your screen, where our panelists will be able to type their responses or indeed address them at the end, live, if we have time. For any questions requiring a more complete answer, I encourage you to fill out our Google Doc that will be included either in the chat or circulated following the event once it has been completed. We'll also be circulating a recording of the webinar online, along with more information to explore Bloomsbury Art Markets on the Bloomsbury Visual Arts Hub, our one-stop digital platform for visual arts resources. So please do look out for that. Given the intricacies of the subject of the art market or art markets, I thought I'd turn to the master of pith to colour our theme. Oscar Wilde, in his usual throwaway manner, is often quoted as saying, when bankers get together, they discuss art. When artists get together, they discuss money. That may be so, but it's not even a fraction of the story of how art accumulates value and around whom or why. A vastly more complex narrative, which we hope to tell, at least in part, today. As to the provenance, if I might put it like that, of Wilde's remark, well, there's no record of him writing it that I can find. Perhaps it was overheard in dialogue, table talk. Perhaps it's wrongly attributed, or perhaps I simply haven't spent long enough in the library. It's funny how when you scratch at the surface of the assumptions we make about artwork and where it comes from, how suddenly mercurial it appears. Indeed, if there are any 19th century specialists attending this event, please feel free to enlighten me and get in touch following the webinar. Anyway, with my preamble included, I'm delighted to hand over to Rosie Trethewey from Bloomsbury's editorial team to give you some important backgrounds to Bloomsbury Art Markets and what makes the resource unique, as a through line to the talks we'll be hearing from our expert panelists in just a moment. Rosie, over to you.
Hello, I'm Rosie Trethewey and I'm the digital editorial lead of Bloomsbury Art Markets at Bloomsbury Digital Resources, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar. Before I hand you over to our speakers, I wanted to provide a very brief introduction to Bloomsbury Art Markets and say how exciting it has been working on this landmark digital reference work. For those of you less familiar with the resource, Bloomsbury Art Markets is a comprehensive guide to art galleries, auction houses, art fairs, and agents from multiple national and historical contexts. We are really proud to say that it is the first scholarly work of its kind online, and this new digital resource is specially designed to serve the expanding research areas of art market studies and provenance research, an area that is becoming increasingly important in the study of art. Led by Editor-in-Chief Johannes Nathan, who we'll be hearing from later, and supported by a distinguished team of editors and advisors, I believe that Bloomsbury Art Markets is truly an essential resource for scholars and researchers, as well as art world professionals. To provide some further context on Bloomsbury Art Markets, The platform launched earlier this year with over 2,200 peer-reviewed articles that combine both factual data with biographical information and historical narratives. With 2 more updates to come in 2024 and 2025, we're really excited that Bloomsbury Art Markets will continue to grow as a resource of over 4,000 articles. The resources include entries covering Europe and North America from 1900 to the present, and outlines principal activities in listing exhibitions, clients, regular partners, and major artists whose work was sold. This resource is fantastic for teaching and researching, and just to name a few ways that it can be used, it allows researchers to discover key players in the art market, to trace auction activities of schools, movements, and styles of art since the 20th century, and to harness detailed narratives of particular movements. The resource is also brilliant for use in galleries, museums, and auction houses, as users can find important contextual information on the provenance and history of artworks, enhance the narrative of an artwork's ownership history, manage risk of the artwork, and accelerate and enhance the delivery of information to consigners. Furthermore, due to it being a part of Bloomsbury Digital Resources, the users can easily use the print, cite, save and share features and use relevant course content for teaching and independent research. A huge amount of work has gone into producing this resource by Johannes and his great team of editors and authors, and I'm very proud to be involved in such an important platform. It is truly a unique resource, and it is fantastic seeing it come to life and continue to grow. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the webinar.
Thank you, Rosie. I'm now going to be introducing our first speaker, the editor-in-chief of Bloomsbury Art Markets. He studied art history at New York University, later receiving his PhD at the Courtauld Institute of Art, London, with a dissertation on the working methods of Leonardo da Vinci. He taught art history at the University of Bern until 2001, when he became director of his family's gallery in Zurich, now Nathan Fine Art in Zurich, Potsdam, a business originally established in Munich in 1913. He has since continued to teach Renaissance art and the history of the art market at the universities of Berlin Technical University, Cologne, Leipzig, Lisbon, New York, NYU, and Zurich. Among his books are Leonardo da Vinci, The Graphic Work, co-authored with Frank Zollner, and The Enduring Instant, Time and the Spectator in the Visual Arts, co-edited with Antoinette Friedenthal. He is a co-founder of the Center for Art Market Studies and a founding member of the International Art Market Studies Association, which he chaired until 2022. He's also a member of the steering committee of the Ukraine Art Aid Center, founded in response of Russia's attack on Ukraine on the 24th of February last year. I'm delighted to give a warm welcome to our first panelist, Johannes Nathan, editor-in-chief of Bloomsbury Art Markets, for a dive into art market history.
Many thanks for the kind introductions, dear Rosie and Jack. It is a great pleasure to speak at this webinar. And before I start with my very quick overview as to how it all came about and how Bloomsbury Art Markets can support research on object history and the history of the art market, I must extend sincerest thanks first to Véronique Chagnon-Berg and Anne Helmreich for contributing to this webinar. Their participation is particularly appropriate as they both supported the creation of this resource as authors, and in the case of Véronique, also as section editor. I must also thank the many, many additional colleagues involved, too numerous to name here, who have helped this project along. The fantastic members of the editorial team, the highly knowledgeable section editors, the esteemed members of the advisory board, the publishing experts from Bloomsbury, and particularly the hundreds of authors without whose help and expertise we would never have been able to bring together this resource. Bloomsbury Art Markets is the result of fantastic scholarly teamwork, and we do hope that it will benefit not only all those who helped, but also the wider scholarly community. When one initiates a project like this, one fortunately does not foresee the unexpected turns and constraints. One also usually underestimates the amount of time and patience required for its realization. But the roughly 10 years that have passed since we started work have at least coincided with a remarkable rise of interest in object history. The change in art historical perspective reassures us that this resource answers a steadily increasing demand. In fact, it was the very practical demands for additional information on the provenance of the many works of art that had passed through my grandfather's and my father's gallery, which suggested to me about 2 decades ago that the compendium on the art market's players and their networks would be helpful for provenance research. My great-grand-uncle, Hugo Helbing, shown here at the rostrum, had been a very successful auctioneer in Munich from the late 19th century onwards. My slide shows a stylish painting by Max Slevogt of a highly publicized auction he held together with the Cassera Gallery in Berlin in 1928, and you may have noticed that we used this image also for Bloomsbury Art Markets. Also from 1922 onwards, my grandfather partnered with his brother in the soon quite successful Ludwigsgalerie, which specialized in German 19th century art, not least Caspar David Friedrich, whose phenomenal view from the cliffs in Rügen was sold in 1930 to the Swiss collector Oskar Reinhardt. Of course, from early 1933 onwards, life in Germany became increasingly intolerable for people of Jewish descent, and my grandfather's family luckily managed to emigrate to Switzerland in 1936, unlike his uncle Hugo Helbing, who was sadly murdered in 1938 and who, until recently, was almost completely forgotten. Not least thanks to Oskar Reinhardt's help, my grandfather could fortunately establish himself as a dealer in Switzerland. During the NS period, he was also involved in the sale of works of art that belonged to émigré collectors, and as such, he had been the subject of much research for about 25 years now. Research which has shown that he had been dealing with conscientious view of all involved parties. Not surprisingly, he usually remained in close contact with many of his consignors long after the end of the war. When the war was over, it emerged that the immigration from Germany to countries such as Great Britain and the United States suddenly provided the opportunity to establish international networks. Thus, when one speaks of globalization today, one should not forget that the post-war years had already brought a boost for globalization, not least for the art market, which now benefited from strong transatlantic relations. However, Germany also remained an important point of reference for my grandfather and soon my father, who joined the business in the mid-1950s. For instance, when they helped Oskar Reinhardt to acquire paintings from the Gerstenberg collection, which had survived in parts during the war in Germany, among them Edouard Manet's Au Café, which I'm showing you now. The provenance of artworks had of course been of interest during the NS years, as it was quite clear that a lot of looting had taken place in these years. After the war, the Allied forces established so-called collecting points, where they assembled and researched the huge amount of art that had been stolen. After years of work, the authorities concluded, however, that not much more could be done. The collecting points were dissolved, and the remaining artworks were entrusted to the governments of the countries from which they were thought to have come. The world now believed that all which could be done had been done, and provenance began to play a very subordinate role, not only in the art market, but also with collectors and in museums. It was only with the opening of archives in Eastern Europe and with the restitution of property in former Eastern Germany that perspectives changed. The then emerging views resulted in the famous Washington Conference of 1998, and suddenly the history of works of art became an important topic. This was the time when I began to work in the family gallery, a time when we were contacted more and more often for information on provenance. While I sometimes sighed over the additional work caused by these inquiries, I was also intrigued. As a trained art historian who had taught at university, by the fascinating contextual information which emerged when one began to piece together the often fragmentary evidence. While it was clear that an index of all major works of art that had changed hands during the last century would be totally out of reach, it became evident that a set of signposts could perhaps provide some guidance in the bewildering landscape of the art market. Let me, for the last part of this contribution, fast forward to this very day by providing just one example on how Bloomsbury art markets can provide interesting contextual evidence as one researches the history of an object. I have chosen a work which Christie's New York will offer in its 20th century evening sale this week. Christie's, which like all major auction houses and galleries today invests considerable efforts in provenance research, has undoubtedly researched the history of this enchanting painting to the widest possible extent. It's actually quite appropriately called Exotischer Garten, exotic garden, which somehow fits the theme of the art market, I think. If you put yourself into the position of an interested collector or museum official contemplating this work, however, you might still want to learn more about the different names that are listed in the provenance. And here, of course, next to the image, I'm showing you the list given in Christie's provenance indications. This is, of course, where Bloomsbury Art Markets comes in. Our resource, in fact, offers illuminating information on all the galleries that handled this work. The entry on Galerie Neue Kunst Fides by Lauren Farrington starts with the usual roster of factual information, then continues with an expertly condensed history. And I'm only showing you detail of this, followed by an excellent summary of the economic situation, which often in our entries provides interesting background information on the fate of a particular gallery or auction house. After lists of artists traded and of selected exhibitions and clients, the entry concludes with an overview over relevant secondary sources and, most importantly, in my view, with information as to where archival material of this establishment can be found, here at the very bottom, where you will see that the estate is in the Staatliche Kunstsammlungen in Dresden. Of course, Bloomsbury Art Markets not only provides information on Probst and his gallery, the first gallery to handle this work in Christie's provenance list, but also on the other art market professionals who handle the painting in question, namely Alfred Flechtheim. I'm not showing you this now, it's just time doesn't allow me to do so. I'm just mentioning these entries. Alfred Flechtheim with an entry written by André Gauthier, the Galerie Buchholz, an entry written by Marie Bilu, and Kurt Valentin, an entry written by Deirdre Robson. Valentin, of course, played an important role at the Buchholz establishment in New York. Sorry, here we just for you to check, we have the complete provenance list again. Now, it might come as a little surprise that when one turns the work by Klee around to look at its back, there is no label of any of the galleries that are named in the provenance. Instead, and I hope you can more or less discern this, the only historic label stems from the Nierendorf Gallery. By now, you will probably not be surprised to hear that Bloomsbury Art Markets, in spite of the fact that it is not yet complete, also provides an entry on this gallery, authored by Helen Schinner. Perusing it, you will realize that Kurt Valentin also played an important role in this establishment, and you will infer that the work was apparently not traded by this gallery, although the exact reason for the appearance of this label on the back of this work is not elucidated by Christie's catalogue entry. I must conclude this very brief survey, which I unfortunately can't widen, by just stating that hopefully my contribution has given you a quick glimpse of the many veins of art market history that can be unlocked by Bloomsbury Art Markets. Those of you who had a closer look at the provenance given by Christie's, still on display, will have noticed that it also includes the name of two major collectors. And the next logical step for us to take with this resource would indeed be to turn from art market players to outstanding collectors. Let us not be too overambitious at this point, however, as we hope that the resource, as it will be on its completion in 2025, will prove to be of sufficient interest to the community to warrant future plans of expansion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Johannes. Fascinating stuff. Our next speaker is an independent scholar and co-founder of the Women Art Dealers Digital Archives. Throughout her career, she has taught a wide range of subjects in art market studies and art history at Queen's College, Parsons School of Design, and Hunter College, among other institutions. Her museum and research positions include work at the Museum of Modern Art and the College Art Association. From 2002 to 2021, she was the director of Christie's Education in New York, where she taught the history of the art market and art history with classes on French art and women artists in particular. A specialist in the history of 19th century French landscape painting and the role of women in the art world, she received her PhD from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and her MA from the Institute of Fine Arts of New York University. She's also a graduate of the École du Louvre in museum designs. Her recent work includes organizing academic conferences on art history and art market studies, such as celebrating female agency in the art world in June 2018, and Women Art Dealers 1940 to 1990 in May 2019. Her current collaborative project is the Women Art Dealers Digital Archive, a digital platform that maps the role women art dealers played in the institutionalization of modern and contemporary art. Last year, she was elected co-chair of the International Art Market Studies Association. It's my pleasure to introduce Veronique Shannon-Burke, section editor on Bloomsbury Art Markets, who'll be speaking on expanding our knowledge on women art dealers. Veronique, I'm about to hand the floor to you.
Thank you so much for the kind invitation, Bloomsbury Art Market, and also for Jack and Rosie to have invited me, and very happy to be with all of you today to try to start demonstrating how Bloomsbury Art Market can really help us become better scholars and better art historians. So today I want to start with a kind of tongue-in-cheek beginning and not just ask what's wrong with these pictures, because I think this is really obvious. The fact that, yes, women dealers like Mary Queen Sullivan was friends with Abby Rockefeller and with Lily Bliss. They did created the Museum of Modern Art, as we all know. But it's important to see that this tongue-in-cheek photograph that represent her cultural entrepreneur Duchamp, Alfred Barr, and Sidney Janis, the art dealer, is a great entry into my little talk today. And the idea that my colleagues have already presented, the fact that the art world is an ecosystem with a very tight network of dependency, and it's been more cooperative, and there's been more ways to go from one side to the other that has been sometimes said. So the Bloomsbury Art Market is a wonderful resources to actually change the way that picture looks and come up to think about other ways to understand a more complex, and I would say a more layer and maybe more inclusive understanding of the way art has been modern and contemporary art has been canonized by our institution. So we now come to the heart of the matter, which is, what do we do and how do we bring more visibility to the women art dealer? That's something that I've been trying to do with my colleague Caterina Tocci with WADA. But the idea is, what were the challenges that we were basically encountering, understanding more and creating that more inclusive narrative, a lack of information and scattered information everywhere. So there I've listed some of the institutions I've had to use before, but obviously putting Bloomsbury Visual Arts at the beginning is quite necessary for us now, because one of the two, I think, major importance and the major reason why Bloomsbury Visual Arts is a great tool for us researcher is, first of all, the peer review, I would say, as Johannes and Rosie have mentioned, but also the fact that we know the authors, and we can actually eventually connect with the authors through various networks. So the validation and the academic level of the information is very essential for me, because as my Jack kindly mentioned in the introduction, being a teacher and a professor for many years, wanting to give my students serious tools and serious access to the mechanism of the art world, we grew very frustrated with the quality of the work and the academic depth of the research we could ask them to do. So obviously now things will change for all the art history students, but also the students that study the history of the art market. So I've decided to focus a little bit about this idea of how can the tool provided by the Bloomsbury Art Market help us to get a better sense of the landscape and a better visibility to the women art dealers who were an integral part to this canonization and institutionalization of modern and contemporary art. And I don't have the time to go through all the interesting fascinating stories, and I think this is also one of the great advantage of the of Bloomsbury Art Market is the depth of the involvement and the depth of diversity of the characters that make up that art ecosystem. And this is also just the protagonist aspect is also something that's very important, I think, to us researcher. So one of the challenges of making women art dealers more visible is to find them and to be able to document that they were actually more the norm than they were the exception. And up till now, we have monographs, exhibition catalogs on some major players, but we need to be able to map this better. One of the things that Bloomsbury can help us do is actually understanding better where these women come from. And I think this is something that we've been trying to do with WADA, is trying to figure out what, especially before the 1950s, when more women art dealer became even more the norm than they were before, what pushed these women from the end of the 19th century to the 1950s to become art entrepreneur, to become business women, to kind of challenge these the norms that were expected, where were they coming from? We quickly realized, like Mary Susan Fiegel, for instance, and some of them were artists. Other, like Susan Bolag, for instance, came from families of dealers. Others were collectors and had started by collecting art. Betty Tommen is a good example of this. So we start being able, through the biography, to map who these women are and to understand how they develop their practice, which is one of the major questions we ask ourselves. What kind of strategy did these women art dealers have? How did they measure to their male counterpart? Did they have the same international networks? And obviously, being able to cross-reference name within the art market dictionary, to go from one gallery to another. As we prepared our introduction, I said this is like going down into the rabbit hole and never wanting to leave again. And this is really what the art market, the Bloomsbury art market, manages to do for us. And so I wanted to just take a couple of examples of women that you may have heard and you may not have heard, and understand how through that deep dive in all these protagonists, the history of these galleries, but also the history of the fairs, for instance, we understand and we can reconstruct these careers that sometimes are been a little shoved under the carpet. So I wanted to introduce you to somebody like Zoe Dusan, who was a collector at the beginning and started a gallery in her cottage in Seattle. She was quite interesting as an art dealer because she was one of the first women the first woman art dealers, the first art dealer to give Kusama an exhibition on the West Coast. And she specifically on that Western town on the Pacific was supportive of the Japanese American painters colonies, which at that moment was obviously, because of what happened during World War II, was not always as welcome as it should have been. The same way, and I think that's something that I find a common ground with a lot of these women art dealers. She had relationship with Peggy Guggenheim, so she was not isolated on the West Coast. And she also had a practice of basically running the business out of her house. So is it something that we can start thinking as something that make women art dealers different? Because we know precedent, and through the markets, through the dictionary and all the entries, we can actually reconstruct these images. And moving forward, understanding that what makes the power of also these digital resources is the fact that we navigate between continent and countries. Lia Ruma, I think, who opened the gallery in Milan and in Naples, first in Naples in 1971, and still has a gallery, who is open. Another of the ideas that we have in try of mapping the career of these women is understanding what are their roles with institution. And Lia Ruma transcend our commercial world by also entering into matronage, I would say patronage, major collection, like hosting Vanessa Beecroft, for instance, performance, or helping William Kentridge, promote his work as a set for the opera, or even Kiefer in Milan. So the fact that these women are obviously very involved in more than just being commercial, and this is something that also maybe can link their career. And finally, as I conclude, I wanted to give you a little bit more about our Women Digital Archives, and to understand that without the art market, Bloomsbury art markets, it would have been very difficult for us to actually do the work we do, and even help the next generation of art historians to understand better the central role and the visibility that women art dealers add in our art ecosystem. Thank you very much. I leave you with Lia Ruma now, and we can go on to the next speaker. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Veronique, for taking us down the rabbit hole, as you put it. Our final speaker is Director of the Archives of American Art at the Smithsonian Institution. Prior to her appointment, she was Associate Director at the Getty Foundation and formerly Associate Director of Digital Initiatives at the Getty Research Institute, both of the J. Paul Getty Trust. She's also served as Associate Professor of Art History and Director at the Bacon-Nord Center for the Humanities, Case Western Reserve University. She's written variously, including on The Art Market as a System, Florence Levy's Statistics, which appeared in American Art in autumn 2020, co-authoring in the same year Digital Methods and the Study of the Art Market for the Routledge Companion to Digital Humanities and Art History. You can also find her epilogue to Art Crossing Borders, the birth of an integrated art market in the age of nation states, Europe circa 1780 to 1914, published by Brill. It's my pleasure to introduce Anne Helmreich for our last talk on the subject of reconstructing the art market as ecosystem, who I will now hand over to.
Thank you. And Jack and Rosie, and I'm so delighted to be here with Veronique and Johannes, and just to say I'm looking forward to our next collaboration. It's wonderful to have such great colleagues in the field, and those of you who aren't involved in art market studies, come join us because it's a great team. So in my time with you today, I want to focus on this proposal that the new resource, Bloomsbury Art Markets, and I really want to emphasize that plural, the S there, allows us to approach the study of the art market as an ecosystem. And I think this notion of ecosystem really nicely builds on some other metaphors we've heard: exotic planet, exotic garden, rabbit hole. So, you know, all these metaphors of the natural world. So this is an argument that I've developed through my own research and in my contributions to Bloomsbury Art Markets, which I've tended to focus on my current work on the London art markets in the early 20th century. Now, I'll admit, perhaps when you think of parallels between the natural world and the art market, the first thing you might think of is sharks, right? The notion of predators, of competition over resources. But I want to argue for another perspective, that of interdependence, building what Veronique said, of connection between nodes, between actors, between entities and activities. Sometimes in competition, yes, but maybe even more frequently than we realize, in collaboration, or at least codependence. Now, by having all these entries on galleries, on art dealers, auction houses, and art fairs all brought together under one umbrella, we can more easily find those ties that bind, the links between these entities. We can consider this ecosystem model at different levels of scale, thanks to Bloomsbury Art Markets. For example, at the international scale, as you can see in this collection of entries I've just, in a way, randomly selected and put on the screen. And I think this international scale, as Johannes already pointed out, is really important for thinking about studying the 20th century art market and even earlier. In my own research, I'm now focusing on the development of the art market in New York City, alongside Pamela Fletcher, which you can see in the selection of advertisements. So this is a New York edition of an international journal called the International Studio. And if you look in this New York-based edition, you can see the number of galleries that actually are advertising from elsewhere. There's Paul Kassir that you just heard Johannes mention, Yamanaka and Company that emanates from Japan and ends up with branches in London, as well as New York, and the Berlin Photographic Company. So this notion of an international art market fluidly moving, and then sometimes with barriers and resistance from city to city, I think is key, and you can find that through the art market resources that Bloomsbury's put together. And we should be really mindful how this international scale, in particular transatlantic connections, shaped artistic careers, the choices that were available to artists. So let me briefly illustrate with one example relating to the career of British painter Augustus John. Now, John in London worked with multiple dealers, including John Newstubb of the Chenille Gallery. And that Chenille Gallery, as I've written about for Bloomsbury, was very supportive of sort of artists who self-identified as kind of bohemian. So John was also being actively collected by the American John Quinn. And John Quinn really wants Augustus John to break into the New York market. And this is around 1910. But the advice Quinn gives is fascinating. And again, similar story as Johannes. By knowing all these galleries, you can really unpack, if you will, the advice John is given by Quinn. So Quinn writes to John, stay clear of the photo secession gallery associated with Alfred Stieglitz. He says Stieglitz was formerly a photographer. 2 or 3 years ago, he gave an exhibition of things by Matisse, and last year by a photographer or painter named Steichen, or some such name. Don't think of having anything to do with it. It would kill you. You wouldn't sell a damn thing, and you'd be classed at once with the freaks. When you get around to it, you ought to have an exhibition of paintings, etchings, and drawings, a one-man show, yes, but not at any freak place like the Photo Secession Gallery. So perhaps one might want a different point of view or perspective, which you could find in Art Market Resources. Goes on a couple letters later to John. Now there is a matter I've been meaning to write to you about, and that's about Birnbaum and the Berlin Photographic Company. The Berlin Photographic Company had a branch in New York. Birnbaum has been bothering me like hell about having an exhibition of your things. This is just a word to the wise. Neither do I think you ought to have your first exhibition here at the Berlin Photographic Gallery. As I've written before, it ought to be at Knoedler's Gallery or some such place at that where there be big buyers and big prices. So this notion in one letter of referring to, or a series of letters, multiple places, again, we can understand the significance of these through looking at the biographies and economic situation that have been pulled together. So here's the Photo Secession, a reference to the Berlin Photographic Company, and here's Knoedler's around the time that just before he writes to Quinn. So in addition to the international scale, Bloomsbury Art Markets allows us to look at a more regional scale. And here I've used the filters that you can use in the digital resource to filter down to the United Kingdom. And I want to underscore the ability that, because this is a digital resource, the ways in which you can search and aggregate resources. And if we think of the art market as an interconnected, interdependent system akin to a natural ecosystem, I want to build on this to suggest some avenues for ongoing research or investigation this opens up. The first avenue I want to draw your attention to is how the ecosystem model brings to our attention notions of exchange, of knowledge, of practice that we know took place between dealers and auction houses. In some cases, this exchange was direct. For example, dealers entering into collaborative agreements in order to secure particular works of art. And this is something my colleague Sandra Van Ginhoven has written about. And I'm showing you here a piece of archival evidence from the Knoedler archive that demonstrates how Knoedler went into joint ownership with the dealer Lowry in London to get a particular work of art by Corot. And sometimes we might think of that exchange as more indirect, with shifts in practice occurring collectively and slowly over time, as in the case of changing notions of display, which could be acts of emulation, of call and response. And these images are meant to show that slow, gradual change from a salon style to a single row of display that we can see working themselves through in commercial galleries. And if we think of collaboration and cooperation rather than primarily competition, it enables us to think differently about the systems that sustained artists and the range of options available to them. Again, here I'm showing artist Marcel Duchamp, whose career unfolded over 2 continents, in dialogue with the dealer turned curator Catherine Koo, who helped introduce avant-garde modernism to her city of Chicago, and a great example of Veronique's point about the role women were playing in the 20th century art world. This photograph documents how dealer and turned curator and artist, you can barely make out Catherine Koo, but she's sitting beside Duchamp there. How dealer turned curator and artist together produced knowledge, together cultivated the press. And it's a reminder to us how the role and presence of the specialized art press and the role and presence of art in generalist publications grew dramatically over the second half of the 19th century throughout the 20th century and was another point of collaboration. The ecosystem metaphor can also help us be alert to what happens when we have a density of practice in particular places. Think about the notion of a forest. What forms of life can it sustain and support beyond the trees that constitute the forest? The same can be said of the art market. Once there's sufficient density of the key sites of trade for the art market, dealers, auction houses, then ancillary services can also thrive. And here I'm thinking about transportation, art shipping, conservation, framing, insurance, financing. And with that density of practice also comes possibilities for career and professional development and mobility. As many listeners here today are aware, the profession of auctioneer and art dealer evolved over time in the modern period and depended heavily on acquiring specialized or even insider knowledge that was typically gained through a quasi-apprenticeship system, as opposed to, just formal education. And entries in the Bloomsbury art market elucidate how careers unfolded, as in the case of Isidore Montaigne, who worked for Charles Sedemile and then Georges Petit before starting his own firm. And this is a trajectory similar to David Kroll Thompson, who started his career at the London branch of Goupil, then moved to Agnews in London before starting his own firm, Barbizon House, which capitalized on his expertise he developed in the circle of artists and promoted through his editorship of London Publications, the art journal in the year's art. As the Bloomsbury art market's resource grows, and bad metaphor to have chosen books to illustrate a digital resource, but that's the benefit of a digital resource. We can carry it very easily as opposed to all these stacks of books. As it grows, we as a community will be able to find more and more of these connections. And thus, this will enable reconception of the art market as an interdependent ecosystem. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. It's fascinating to hear about the interdependence of protagonists and also how Bloomsbury Art Markets as a fully cross-searchable resource can support finding all of those points of connection. Really interesting talk. And I'd like to say thank you to panelists Veronique and Johannes, as well as Rosie, for joining us today, and to you all as attendees for attending this inaugural webinar for Bloomsbury Art Markets, Protagonist Networks Provenances, presented by Bloomsbury Digital Resources. I really hope you've enjoyed this event, and I encourage you to discover this fantastic new resource in art market studies by contacting your local Bloomsbury representative for a free trial for your institution. We'll be circulating more information on our channels as to where you can find Bloomsbury Art Markets on the Bloomsbury Digital Arts Hub. So thank you and take care.